Trey Yingst has been doing amazing work as a war correspondent for Fox News in Israel. Good morning, Trey. Welcome to the Hugh Hewitt Show. I'm honored to have you on. That was some reporting yesterday. Tell us about where you were in Lebanon and with whom you were with.
Hugh, thank you for having me. Earlier this week, I got a call before the Israeli ground operation into Lebanon began that we might have an opportunity to join Israeli commandos as they went after a Hezbollah position. And when I got this call, I thought that it was a reconnaissance mission that we'd be joining and covering as part of our story and our part of our reporting in the region. And it ended up that as this got underway, it was actually the larger ground operation that the Israelis were conducting against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And it was quite an experience. I've been on a lot of embeds over the past year. I've embedded inside Gaza 5 different times, but this was in the middle of the night. It was in territory I'd never entered before. And it was a very volatile environment. We had to cross minefields through densely populated forests. And then ultimately we made it to a location that was carved into the side of a mountain that the Israelis say Hezbollah was using to store weapons and personnel.
Trey, I found your interviews with the masked Israeli soldiers, and I don't know if they were commandos, if they were part of the 98th Paratroop or the 36th Division has entered today. Are you at liberty to tell us what unit you were with?
I'm not. And there are very few things I'll agree upon when it comes to these embeds. And I'll tell you what they are right now, actually, because I think it's important to discuss them publicly. There are basically two things that I agree to by going into Gaza or into Lebanon with the Israeli military. One is that I won't give up the location of their forces or the specific units I'm with if they make that request. And then two is that I won't show any sensitive screens or documents as we capture them in the course of our reporting. Other than that, the military has no editorial control over the coverage or the piece that I air.
Thank you for telling us that. I thought it was remarkable that they let you go. Now, tell me, have you been in the tunnels of Gaza? Because I would like a comparison, if it's possible, between the Hezbollah tunnels in Lebanon and the Hamas tunnels in Gaza. But to do that, you have to have been in both, and I know you've been at least in one in Lebanon.
Yeah, I've been in both. I entered the tunnel beneath Gaza's Shifa hospital with the Israelis last November and reported there. And if you look up that piece, you'll see that much like the piece I just did in Lebanon, it has proper context to what this means about that hospital and also the civilians that were affected inside Gaza as a result of the Israelis operating against the tunnel beneath Shifa. I also entered a more complex tunnel network beneath the second largest city in Gaza called Han Yunis. And just to give you a comparison how these tunnels are different, you can tell that Hezbollah has the ability to dig deeper into the ground. They have heavier equipment and they are able to tunnel into the side of mountains. Whereas the tunnels inside Gaza, some of them are dug by hand. They don't have this heavy equipment. And while they have cement and reinforcements that they place into the tunnel network, they are far more, I would say, basic than the tunnels inside southern Lebanon.
The piece that you published yesterday, and that people can find at Trey Yingst, and you can find Trey on X. He puts a lot of his reports there, or you can find him via Hugh Hewitt on X, because I linked and quote tweeted his post. It's rocky. I mean, it's granite. How in the world does the IDF propose? Did they even tell you? Are they going to destroy these tunnels? Because that's going to make a lot of the Lebanon landscape change if they try and do that.
Yeah, absolutely. They probably will ultimately destroy them in the way that they destroyed some of the tunnel network in Gaza. They'll send in these units who have specialized explosives and then they leave them throughout different parts of the tunnel and then detonate the tunnel to make it implode on itself. They did this a number of times in Gaza. It does cause quite a bit of destruction above ground as well. And some of these tunnels are very far underground. I've been reporting in this region for the past 6 years. I've entered Gaza and Lebanon without the Israeli military in the past before this war began. And we've seen a lot of this infrastructure firsthand. And it's extensive. And it also complicates the battlefield because the Israelis are fighting a war above and below ground. Inside Gaza, it led to many ambushes. And already Israeli forces are starting to see, as we saw yesterday with 8 Israeli soldiers killed, it's a different environment to operate in. And from a war perspective, The Israelis knew this going into it, and they started this ground operation anyway. And as this develops, this is not going to be a limited raid. We're already seeing this is an expanded operation into southern Lebanon against Hezbollah.
Well, two divisions, and it continues to advance. I want to ask you, Trey Yingst. I know Lucas, so I know Lucas and how he goes back and forth. You've been there under some of the heaviest weather. I know Lucas and your other colleagues have been there under heavy weather as well. But where were you during the ballistic missile assault?
I was on a balcony in Israel's Haifa, the third largest city in Israel, and we were watching these ballistic missiles. Some of them get intercepted by the advanced Arrow 3 system, and others slamming into the ground below. I've lived here for the past 6 years, and so we've seen a lot, but the ballistic missile attacks are unique in many ways. And I would say the most significant is the fact that this attack came directly from Iranian territory. It was often considered the worst case scenario. And we also reported back in April, we were in Tel Aviv at the time watching ballistic missiles rain down on Israel back then. And I think it speaks to the broader sort of destabilization across the region, because the fact that Iran is directly firing on Israel means that we've taken another step up on the escalation ladder. And no longer is this just a war between Israel and Hamas inside Gaza or an exchange of fire along the northern border between Israel and Hezbollah. This is already a broader regional conflict, and it has the real potential to unravel further than what we've seen already.
Now, some people are calling this the third Lebanon war, and I think that's a misnomer. I think it's the first Israel-Iran war. Trey Yingst, you were with combat soldiers on the front line 2 days ago. What are they telling you about what they hope the government does in response to the Iranian second attack on Israel with ballistic missiles? I'd like to know what the grunt in Israel thinks about what their government ought to do.
I've talked with Israeli officials as high up as the defense minister this week. I've also talked with soldiers who were entering on the ground as part of these commando units into southern Lebanon. And the sense is that this war is not anywhere close to being over. And I think that's a real misunderstanding in the United States when we talk about this conflict, that it's sort of coming toward an end. It's actually, as you noted, the beginning of a broader conflict, a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. And remember, the proxy organizations of Iran have been operating across the region for the past year, launching ballistic missile attacks and rocket attacks and a variety of other border attacks, including anti-tank guided missile attacks. And these weapons aren't being made in southern Lebanon. They're being smuggled there through Syria, and the Iranian regime is providing the weapons. And so, in terms of the soldiers, and even as high up as the defense minister, the sense is that there will be a heavy response against Iran. Officials that I talked to over the phone that are based in Tel Aviv, that are very close to the operations and decisions that are being made about this war, told me just after the ballistic missile attack that it's not a question of if Israel responds, but rather when and where. And the soldiers on the ground, their spirits are high, but they know they're going to take heavier losses in Lebanon. And I think yesterday was the best example of that. And it also sort of cuts to the Israeli psyche about what these conflicts mean. This is a very small country. It's less than 10 million people. So when 8 soldiers are killed during ground battles against Hezbollah, for example, like we saw yesterday, it affects the population in a different way than maybe a larger country would see if they lose 8 of their soldiers in combat.
Yeah, just multiply by 30, because the American population at 330 versus the Israeli population at 10 times 33 times 8, and that would be the equivalent loss of American military, and it would be stunning. Trey Yingst, you mentioned in your report yesterday, you went through a minefield in Lebanon. Can you tell us about that experience, how big it was, and how I mean, the Israelis obviously have extraordinary intel, but I've not. Dexter Filkins, John Fisher Burns, Tom Ricks, they've all been on the program. I don't know that any of them have ever gone through a minefield before.
Yeah, Hugh, I've been a lot of places and I've covered a lot of wars for the past decade. I was on the ground in Kyiv, Ukraine, as the Russians launched their invasion. I was in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. I was in southern Israel on the morning of October 7th. I just wrote a book about it. Going through a minefield on the border between Israel and Lebanon was definitely one of the scariest things that I've ever done. And we had very few instructions. It was dark, and all of the special forces that were around and the commando unit that we were with had night vision. We did not. And we were given basically one broad instruction, and that was to follow a white string and step into the footsteps of the person in front of you while staying 2 people apart. And they give you those instructions because if the person in front of you steps on a mine, they don't want it to kill you. And when you're getting these instructions in real time, you don't really have time to process what they're telling you. You just want to follow the commands so that you can preserve your life. But when you look back, it's clear that this is real. This is on the front lines, beyond the front lines of a conflict, walking into Hezbollah controlled territory. Now, these mines were laid by the Israeli military to prevent Hezbollah from coming into northern Israel. But at this point in the conflict, in the middle of the night, the forces that we're with didn't lay the mines. They don't know exactly where they are. They're simply relying on that white piece of string or tape that is connected to a tree. And so we followed that, we crossed, and once we made it into southern Lebanon, it was quite intense hiking. We had to stop every so often and get down flat, sort of on one knee, and you could hear the buzz of Israeli drones overhead, and they were looking for heat signatures of Hezbollah fighters. And once the area was clear in front of us, we would move forward, and then the commander would get a signal, we would stop again, and in the distance, we could hear Israeli airstrikes as they were hammering different Hezbollah positions across the area. And so it was a very active scene. There were no engagements while we were with Israeli forces, no firefights that took place on that mission. But it does give you a sense of the type of terrain and territory that these forces are now operating in as they enter southern Lebanon.
Trey, I may have to take a break, and I want to talk to you in between the break if I can. Would you tell me what was the elevation gain in terms of the march in? Because it sounds like it's a very rolling hill, but gradual elevation. Is that what you were in yesterday or 2 days ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Initially, we went up a hill, and then when we crossed the border, we actually went down a riverbed, and this hadn't been cleared. Reconnaissance units clearly had gone through this area before. They had it mapped out where we were going, but we were going through brush and trees that had not been cleared. The Israelis were having to break branches and sort of crawl under things, and we followed them because this was the area that we were operating in, and we needed to just continue to move forward.
Stand by for a second, Trey. I've got to pull down the line to take a break. I'll continue to talk to Trey Yingst, Fox News correspondent from Haifa, Israel, just back from Lebanon for another 3 or 4 minutes, and I'll put that on hopefully next hour. Stay tuned, America. I am back now with Trey Yingst, reporting, and I appreciate all the time, Trey, from Israel this morning. Tell me, did the I.D.F. engage Hezbollah terrorists in their incursion? Because I see a report this morning that 60 Hezbollah terrorists have been killed, 8 I.D.F. soldiers have been killed. Was that a firefight? Were you near it?
On the mission that we were on, we were not near that firefight, and we actually didn't even hear any gunfire. We heard airstrikes in the distance. And that was very different to what we experienced during embeds inside Gaza when there were firefights that we were in the middle of between Hamas and Israeli forces.
So, Trey, my last question is this. You're a Keystone State person. You're a long way from Pennsylvania. Are you wondering how you ended up there? Are you going to stay for the duration of the war, which could go another year? It might be October 7th, 2025, and we might still have the I.D.F. fighting Hezbollah terrorists in the outskirts of Beirut, and we might have them further into Syria. It's impossible to say. Are you there for the duration?
Absolutely. I'll be here until the war is over. I feel a responsibility to be here on the ground to capture what's happening and bring these stories to the world. You'll notice from my reporting, I take no sides in this conflict or any of the wars that we cover around the world. It's important for me to talk about Israeli civilians and those who were killed on the morning of October 7th when this war began. I also speak with Palestinian civilians inside Gaza on a regular basis to understand the suffering that they're experiencing amid this conflict. And the same goes for the northern front between Israel and Hezbollah. And you'll notice this as part of our reporting. It is a humans first style of coverage. And I do feel a responsibility to follow in the footsteps of the greats that came before me, the Edward R. Murrows, the Walter Cronkites, the people who did journalism the way that I think it should be done, to go to the front lines, to get the stories and bring them back to an audience in an objective and truthful way. And so I'll stay here.
What is your new book, Trey? When does it drop? When is it available?
So my new book actually came out literally while I was in southern Lebanon on October 1st, and it's called Black Saturday. It came out this week, and it's a firsthand account of my reporting in southern Israel on the morning of October 7th, and also a collection of my interviews with Israeli soldiers, with police officers, with civilians, with hostages who were released as part of the November ceasefire deal. I also speak with Hamas leadership, and I speak with Palestinian civilians, everyone involved in this story. And it gives the reader a real understanding of what happened on the morning of October 7th and also what the first 2 months of the war were like.
Black Saturday. Who's the publisher, Trey?
Publisher is HarperCollins, and it's a Fox News book.
Fox News book, Black Saturday by Trey Yingst. I will go to Amazon right now and order it, Trey, because I don't want to wait for the publisher to get it to me. But I appreciate your joining me this morning after I've read it. I hope you will come back. God be with you and stay safe. Thank you for spending time with not only the soldiers, but the civilians of the region. Trey Yingst of Fox News. Be well.